Most people misunderstand avoidant attachment. They assume the avoidant is cold, emotionally unavailable, or incapable of real intimacy. That's surface-level observation. The truth is more complex. Avoidants often feel deeply, sometimes more intensely than they show, but they learned early that closeness comes with risk. So they create distance before anyone can create pain. That's why many avoidants appear powerful in relationships. They control the emotional distance. They decide when to engage, when to disappear, and when to reappear. The person chasing them often believes the avoidant has all the power. But psychologically, control and safety are not the same thing. Someone can control a situation because they are afraid of what happens when they lose it. This is where one type of empath changes everything. Not the dramatic empath. Not the overgiving empath. Not the one who keeps proving loyalty after every withdrawal. Those patterns actually reinforce avoidant defenses. The avoidant learns they can pull away, and the other person will work harder for closeness. That confirms the avoidant's expectation. Intimacy equals pressure. The empath who shifts the entire dynamic the self-regulated empath. This person understands emotions deeply, but they are not controlled by them. They feel everything in the room, but they do not react impulsively. They do not beg for reassurance. They do not collapse when someone becomes distant. They stay present without losing themselves. That type creates a problem for the avoidant. Avoidants often rely on one pattern to maintain emotional safety: withdrawal. When they sense emotional intensity, expectations, or vulnerability, they step back. Sometimes physically, sometimes emotionally. It's a defense mechanism that protects them from dependency. They learned that if they disconnect first, they remain safe. But the self-regulated empath does something unusual. They do not chase that withdrawal. When the avoidant pulls away, the empath stays centered. No interrogation, no emotional explosion, no desperate explanation. The empath remains emotionally available but detached from the need to control the outcome. That silence becomes psychologically loud. Why? Because avoidants are accustomed to people reacting. Most people respond to distance with more effort, more texts, more questions, more emotional demands. He avoidant expects to trigger pursuit. It's predictable. But when someone doesn't react to the distancing, the avoidant loses the script. The usual defense no longer produces control. Instead, the avoidant is left alone with something they avoid most: their own emotional awareness. This is where many people make the mistake of assuming the avoidant doesn't care. In reality, avoidants often process emotions in isolation. They may appear calm externally while internally cycling through anxiety, curiosity, and attachment activation. Their silence can hide obsession. The grounded empath triggers that because they represent something rare. They offer emotional intimacy without emotional captivity. That distinction matters. Avoidants fear being consumed by another person's needs. When someone requires constant reassurance, the avoidant experiences closeness as a burden. But the grounded empath offers connection without demands. That feels safe and unfamiliar. Human psychology is attracted to what breaks expectation. The avoidant expects attachment to cost autonomy. Then they meet someone emotionally intuitive who doesn't trap them, doesn't chase them, and doesn't crumble when end space is created. That creates cognitive dissonance. The avoidant starts asking internal questions they don't normally confront. Why am I thinking about them? Why didn't they react? Why do I feel closer when they said less? This is because the self-regulated empath becomes psychologically significant through emotional stability. Stability is not exciting in a dramatic sense, but it is deeply activating to someone whose entire relational system is built around unpredictability. The avoidant begins to notice something else. They cannot provoke insecurity. That changes everything. Many unhealthy relationship dynamics rely on emotional imbalance. One person distances. The other person pursues. One person controls access. The other person seeks validation. That loop can continue for years. But the self-regulated empath refuses that role. They recognize distance without personalizing it. They understand that someone else's withdrawal is information, not a verdict on their worth. That makes them almost impossible to destabilize. And when someone cannot be destabilized, they become psychologically compelling. Avoidants are often drawn toward emotional mystery. The empath who remains calm under uncertainty becomes hard to read. The avoidant may expect to be the unreadable one, but now they are the one trying to decode. That reversal often creates fixation. This is why some avoidants return after long silence. It's not always because they suddenly changed. Often, it's because they expected emotional access to remain available, and when they encounter someone who respected themselves enough not to chase, they feel the loss of that emotional anchor. The grounded empath doesn't force introspection. They trigger it by absence of chaos. That's a powerful distinction. Some people believe transformation happens through confrontation. But for avoidance, confrontation often reinforces defense. Calm presence followed by emotional boundaries is far more disruptive, because now the avoidant sees a person who understood them, cared for them, and still walked without collapsing. That can challenge their entire belief system. Avoidants often believe closeness means losing freedom, being judged, or being trapped in emotional intensity. But when they encounter someone who offered closeness without control, those assumptions weaken. The defense becomes less just, ifid. And when defenses weaken, attachment becomes visible. The avoidant may suddenly initiate more contact, ask unusual questions, show subtle jealousy, revisit old conversations, appear emotionally inconsistent. These are signs of internal conflict, not necessarily growth. They may feel genuine attachment while still fearing dependence. That's why this empath type affects them so deeply. The empath is not overpowering them. They are removing the avoidance hiding places. No chase means no distraction. No emotional panic means no justification for retreat. No neediness means no reason to frame intimacy as pressure. The avoidant is left facing what they feel, often for the first time without a defense strong enough to bury it. This can look like obsession. Not because the empath manipulated them, but because emotional truth became unavoidable. And here's the deeper lesson. The self-regulated empath is not powerful because they are trying to win the avoidant. They are powerful because they are emotionally whole with or without the avoidance response. That independence is what creates the strongest psychological impact. Because the person who cannot be controlled by DI stance becomes the one distance cannot erase. Avoidants are often misunderstood because people judge them by behavior instead of internal experience. When someone becomes distant, avoids hard conversations, or seems emotionally unavailable, it's easy to assume they simply do not care. But in most cases, the opposite is true. Avoidants are not detached from emotion, they are defended against it. Their emotional world can be intense, but they've learned to protect themselves by controlling how much of it anyone gets to see. This pattern usually begins long before adult relationships. Many avoidants grew up in environments where emotional needs were ignored, criticized, or met with inconsistency. They may have learned that showing vulnerability led to disappointment, rejection, or feeling trapped. Over time, the mind adapts. Instead of openly expressing fear, sadness, or dependence, they suppress it. They become skilled at appearing unaffected, even when they feel deeply inside. That's why avoidants often create emotional distance when relationships become serious. It's not always because their feelings are weak. Sometimes it's because the feelings are becoming too strong. Intimacy. Why creates exposure, and exposure creates risk. The more someone matters to them, the more they may feel the urge to pull away. It looks contradictory from the outside, but internally it makes sense. They retreat not because connection means nothing, but because it means too much. This defense can make them appear calm, rational, or even indifferent during emotional conflict. But that calm is often a strategy. Many avoidants process everything privately. They may leave a conversation and spend hours replaying every word. They may ignore a message while thinking about it constantly. Their silence can hide stress, fear, and attachment they are not comfortable admitting. One of the biggest mistakes people make is assuming an avoidance distance is proof of emotional absence. Distance is often their way of regulating fear. They create space because closeness activates uncertainty. They want connection, but they also fear losing independence, being consumed by expectations, or becoming vulnerable to pain. That's what makes avoidant behavior confusing. They may care deeply, miss someone intensely, and still pull away at the exact moment the bond becomes meaningful. Their actions are always a measure of their feelings. Often, they are a measure of how unsafe those feelings feel to them. What looks like disinterest is frequently self-protection, a learned defense against emotional exposure they were never taught how to safely manage. One specific empath type tends to affect avoidance more than almost anyone else. the calm, self-contained empath who does not chase. This person changes the dynamic because they do something the avoidant rarely expects. They care deeply, sense emotions accurately, and understand what is happening beneath the surface. Yet they do not become consumed by the avoidant's withdrawal. That combination is powerful because it removes the usual emotional pattern the avoidant relies on. Avoidants often expect distance to create pursuit. When they pull back, many people react immediately. They ask what is wrong, send repeated messages, seek reassurance, or work harder to restore closeness. To the avoidant, this confirms a familiar belief. Relationships eventually become emotionally demanding. Their withdrawal feels justified because it produces the very pressure they fear. The cycle continues. They distance, the other person pursues, and he avoids the need to escape even more. The calm empath breaks that cycle completely. They notice the withdrawal, but they do not panic. They don't chase explanations or force emotional conversations before the other person is ready. They remain emotionally present, but they maintain their own center. That creates something unfamiliar for the avoidant: connection without pressure. This type of empath is difficult for avoidants to categorize because they are emotionally aware without being emotionally dependent. They can sense pain behind silence, but they don't make that pain their responsibility to fix. They can offer warmth without losing boundaries. The avoidant may expect to trigger insecurity by becoming distant, but instead they encounter steadiness. That steadiness becomes psychologically disruptive. The avoidant's usual defense depends on controlling emotional distance. If they step back and the other person remains grounded, the expected sense of control weakens. The avoidant is left with no distraction from their own internal response. They begin to notice how much the empath matters because the empath's absence of pursuit creates space for their own attachment to surface. The self-contained empath also creates emotional safety. They don't invade the avoidant's autonomy, but they also don't disappear into the avoidant's emotional rhythms. They remain themselves. That can feel deeply attractive because avoidants often fear being engulfed by another person's needs. When someone can connect deeply without demanding constant reassurance, the avoidant may feel safe enough to lower defenses. What makes this empath powerful is not manipulation or mystery. It is emotional regulation. They show care without surrendering self-respect. They can walk away from silence without resentment. And that often becomes unforgettable to an avoidant because they realize they met someone who understood them completely, but refused to abandon themselves to keep the connection alive. Avoidants are often deeply attracted to emotional safety, even if they rarely admit it. They notice people who feel calm, trustworthy, and emotionally grounded because part of them longs for that stability. Like anyone else, they want to feel understood, accepted, and close to someone. The difference is that for avoidants, the desire for connection is often followed by an equally strong fear, the fear of emotional dependence. That conflict creates one of the most confusing relationship patterns, the push-pull dynamic. At first, avoidants may move toward someone quickly when they feel safe. They may open up more than expected, spend meaningful time together, and show signs of genuine attachment. This stage often surprises people because avoidants can seem fully present when they choose to engage. The connection feels real because it usually is. They are drawn to warmth, emotional intelligence, and the comfort of someone who doesn't judge them. But as emotional closeness increases, another process begins. The avoidant starts sensing risk. The relationship now matters enough that losing it could hurt. Expectations may grow. Emotional intimacy may require vulnerability. Dependence becomes possible. That's when the fear activates. To someone with avoidant patterns, depending on another person can feel like surrendering control, and control often equals safety in their internal world. This creates the pull. They move toward the person because the connection feels comforting, validating, and emotionally meaningful. But once they start feeling attached, the push quote begins. They may suddenly need space, become less responsive, or act distant without clear explanation. To the other person, it feels inconsistent or contradictory. But internally, the avoidant is often trying to reduce the intensity of their own emotional exposure. The more meaningful the bond becomes, the stronger this cycle can be. An avoidant may deeply miss someone during distance, yet still hesitate to reconnect because closeness triggers the same fears again. They may think about the person constantly while appearing indifferent. They may crave emotional security while resisting the very intimacy that creates it. This dynamic can be painful for both people because it creates confusion. The partner sees affection, then withdrawal, interest, then silence. The avoidant often feels trapped between opposing needs. They want the comfort of emotional connection, but fear what that connection might demand from them. The push-pull dynamic is not usually about deception. It is often a defense system. The avoidant moves closer when they feel safe, then backs away when attachment starts to feel too powerful. Their actions are shaped by a conflict between longing and self-protection. Tion. They seek emotional safety, but when safety turns into emotional reliance, fear takes over, and distance becomes their way of restoring control. The grounded empath affects avoidance in a way many people don't understand because they don't try to force closeness. They notice emotional shifts, they sense what is happening beneath the silence, and they often understand feelings that the avoidant has not even spoken aloud. But unlike people who react to that awareness by pushing for answers, the grounded empath stays steady. They mirror emotional truth without demanding immediate connection. That changes the entire dynamic. Avoidants often depend on certain escape routes when emotions become intense. If a relationship begins to feel too vulnerable, they may withdraw, become vague, or create distance. Sometimes they stop responding as quickly. Sometimes they become focused on work, distractions, or practical reasons for needing space. These behaviors often serve one purpose: reducing emotional exposure. The avoidant uses distance to regain a sense of control when closeness starts to feel overwhelming. Most people respond by trying to close that distance. They ask what happened. They seek reassurance. They try to fix the tension. That reaction gives the avoidant something familiar. It reinforces the idea that closeness eventually leads to pressure. The avoidant can then justify retreat by saying they need freedom, space, or less emotional intensity. The escape route stays open because the other person steps into the predictable role of pursuer. The grounded empath does not enter that role. They can see the fear behind the withdrawal, but they don't chase it. They don't demand explanations to soothe their own anxiety. They remain calm enough to let the silence reveal what it needs to reveal. That calm presence acts like a mirror. The avoidant sees their own emotional behavior reflected back without the usual distractions of conflict or pursuit. That mirror creates discomfort because it removes the avoidant's external focus. If the other person does not panic, the avoidant has fewer reasons to blame the relationship for their stress. They are left facing the source of the discomfort, their own fear of vulnerability. The grounded empath isn't accusing them. They are simply staying emotionally honest. And that honesty quietly exposes the pattern. This can be deeply unsettling for avoidants because many of their defenses work best when another person reacts emotionally. If someone becomes upset, the avoidant can focus on managing that reaction or escaping from it. But when the empath stays centered, there is no emotional chaos to point at. The silence becomes revealing. The avoidant begins noticing that the discomfort is not caused by the empath's behavior, but by the closeness itself. That's why the grounded empath removes escape routes. They don't block the avoidant physically or emotionally. They simply refuse to participate in the cycle that protects the avoidant from self-awareness. Their calmness leaves no distraction, and their boundaries prevent emotional games from controlling the connection. In that space, the avoidant often experiences something unfamiliar: being understood completely without being chased, pressured, or emotionally managed. That kind of connection can become impossible to forget because it exposes emotional truth without force. Silence and emotional consistency can affect avoidance more deeply than pressure because they interrupt the patterns avoidants have learned to expect. Many people believe our effort creates stronger connection. They think repeated reassurance, emotional talks, or constant contact will bring an avoidant closer. But with avoidant personalities, pressure often activates defenses. The more they feel pursued, the more they associate connection with losing freedom. What often creates deeper attachment is something quieter: the steady presence of someone who doesn't need to force closeness. Silence can be powerful because it removes noise. When an avoidant withdraws, many people fill that gap immediately. They ask what changed, why messages slowed, whether something is wrong. That reaction shifts the focus away from the avoidant's internal state and onto the conflict itself. The avoidant becomes busy managing the other person's reaction, defending their space, or explaining distance. Their emotional attention moves outward, but when someone responds with calm silence, something changes. The avoidant has more room to feel what is happening internally. They notice the absence. They recognize the missing interaction. The emotional significance of the relationship becomes clearer because there is no emotional struggle distracting them. Silence gives their own thoughts space to surface, and for many avoidants, that's where attachment becomes undeniable. Emotional consistency matters just as much. Avoidants often expect people to become unpredictable under stress. They may assume closeness leads to demands, emotional highs and lows, or instability. If someone becomes anxious each time distance appears, it confirms the avoidant's belief that relationships become overwhelming. But a person who remains emotionally consistent changes that expectation. They care without changing their self-respect. They remain kind without becoming desperate. They stay grounded whether connection is close or distant. That steadiness can create trust in a way pressure never can. The avoidant begins to see someone whose emotional state does not depend entirely on their behavior. That reduces the fear of being responsible for another person's emotions. Instead of feeling trapped by expectations, they may begin to feel safe. Safety is what allows attachment to deepen. People often think avoidants fear intimacy because they don't value connection. More often, they fear losing control inside connection. Emotional consistency shows them that closeness does not have to mean chaos. It can exist without drama, guilt, or emotional demands. Over time, silence and consistency become memorable. The avoidant notices the person who didn't react to every shift, who stayed honest without forcing answers, and who remained stable through uncertainty. That kind of presence stands out because it creates something rare, a relationship where emotional truth exists without pressure. And when an avoidant experiences that, attachment can grow in ways they never expected, precisely because no one tried to make it happen. The avoidant's strongest emotional reactions often appear when they meet someone who cannot be influenced by withdrawal. This is because withdrawal is one of the most common ways avoidants protect themselves. When emotions feel intense, they may create distance, become less available, delay responses, or seem emotionally detached. These behaviors are often not conscious attempts to control someone, but they do create a dynamic where the avoidant manages closeness by controlling access to themselves. In many relationships, that pattern works. The other person notices the distance and reacts. They reach out more, ask what went wrong, seek reason, assurance, or try harder to reconnect. That response restores a sense of emotional control for the avoidant. They may not plan it that way, but the pattern becomes familiar. Distance leads to pursuit. The avoidant sets the pace, and the other person adjusts around them. Then they meet someone who doesn't respond that way. This person notices the withdrawal but doesn't chase after it. They don't send repeated messages, demand explanations, or treat silence as proof of rejection. They continue living their life. They remain emotionally respectful, but they do not sacrifice their self-worth to keep the connection alive. That creates something deeply unfamiliar for the avoidant. Suddenly, withdrawal no longer produces the expected result. There is no emotional scramble, no dramatic pursuit, no visible insecurity to reassure the avoidant that they still control the emotional distance. The pattern stops working. And when a long-standing defense stops working, it often triggers strong internal reactions. At first, the avoidant may feel confused. They may wonder whether the person cares less than expected. But as time passes, that calm response often becomes psychologically significant. The avoidant starts noticing the absence of pursuit. They may check for signs of attention, replay conversations, or feel unexpectedly preoccupied. What once gave them comfort creating space now creates uncertainty. That uncertainty can intensify attachment because the avoidant is no longer distracted by managing someone else's reaction. Instead, they are left with their own emotional response. They may realize they miss the person more than expected. They may become curious, reach out unexpectedly, or feel jealous when they sense the person has emotionally moved forward. The strongest reaction happens because the avoidant encounters a person who cannot be emotionally controlled by distance. Not because that person is cold, but because they are secure enough not to interpret withdrawal as a signal to chase. That removes the avoidant's usual leverage in the dynamic. For many avoidants, this creates an uncomfortable but revealing moment. They realize distance does not erase connection. Silence does not guarantee emotional control. And someone who stays grounded without pursuing may become far more significant than the people who constantly tried to hold on. When withdrawal stage, ops shaping the relationship, the avoidant often faces something they can no longer avoid: how deeply they actually feel.